Now, you may recall a couple of sheds ago, I read out an email from our friend John, who'd had a painful encounter with a fundamentalist friend who basically told him that if he didn't pack in his progressive ideas about faith and come back to the truth of the inerrancy of Scripture, that he was headed for hell. Now, that all sounds pretty bizarre, really, does to me. But, when it is a long-time friend who's telling you that you're going to toast for eternity, it's hard and it's a bit difficult to, follow it up with, should we have a cup of tea? It's painful. Anyway, this week, Kerry in Melbourne contacted me to support John, but also to say that she's had, similar discussions with fundamentalist friends, which were frustrating and which also, threatened relationships. And she decided that these conversations actually weren't real conversations, I guess because, if there's no real openness to the possibility that you might be wrong and to there may be other understandings, then it isn't really a conversation at all. And so Kerry says, I now tiptoe round discussions until I find some small degree of openness or curiosity in the other person where I might feel comfortable to bring some of my truth into the conversation. She says, I want to remain respectful of other people, but I also need boundaries so that, that my views are going to be respected too. I certainly don't want to be told I'm going to hell, she says, because I'm not. So, it's all tricky, isn't it? And anyway, Kerry says that she'd like to hear from other shedsters any experiences that you've had along these lines. And another interesting point that she raises is that she says she's reluctant to label herself a progressive Christian because she's not sure what that conjures up for some people. I guess, it can certainly convey, a kind of sense of elitism, can't it? So that's an excellent point that Kerry makes, which is why I tend to speak of progressive approaches to faith rather than creating another label. I'm much more interested in seeing terms, both progressive and Christian, to see these as verbs instead of nouns, as ways of being instead of, badges to wear. If I'm ever asked if, then I'm happy to say that I am a Christian, even happier to say I'm a follower of Jesus. But in the right context, I'm also happy to say that I have a progressive approach to faith. So today, continuing in this sort of theme, I want to talk a bit more about the Bible from a progressive point of view. I've always made it clear in the shed how important the Bible still is to my Christian faith, despite my many quarrels, tiffs and fracas with it. However, I'd like to just spend a moment to say why and how it's important to me. But first, a couple of sheds ago, I commented that Genesis 1 to 11 is basically a piece of classic night language. In other words, those opening chapters of Genesis are myth, not fact. Story, not a reporting of actual events. Now, I confess to feeling actually a little bit daft even saying this, really, that accounts of the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah and the flood, and Methuselah living to 969 years of age are not supposed to be read as literal fact. I mean, that is just so blindingly obvious to me. But the person who took issue with me about these things on the Facebook, the Holy Shed Facebook page a couple of weeks ago, isn't alone, because I think lots of fundamentalist Christians and creationists would tear their hair out at many of the things that I say. Actually, I'm just amazed that there are any fundamentalists around me who've got any hair left at all. Anyway, the person concerned maintained that there really was a global flood, after which, she says, that the landscape of the world and the climate changed, meaning that people no longer could live to the ages described in Genesis. And that's the kind of explanation for why you've got all those, huge sort of ages of people, and then it stopped. And I'm afraid to say this is basically scientific gobbledygook. There is no evidence for a global flood or for people living for hundreds of years. Absolutely none. In point of fact, The story of the flood isn't even original to the Bible. It's a retelling of a much older story that goes way back to Sumerian civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a version of Noah and the flood, first appeared in the third millennium BC. The third millennium BC. It's history's oldest known fictional story. Meanwhile, the Genesis texts that speak about the flood date to between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC. So, Johnny come latelys by comparison. Of course, Genesis tells the story differently to reflect the theological twists and beliefs of the Hebrew people rather than the Mesopotamians. And, I'm all for Genesis. I love the Genesis stories. I love all of this stuff. And I'll tell you what, sometime let's look at the Epic of Gilgamesh in the shed, shall we? That would be great. But the real point is this: who the heck cares? Why should it be an issue as to whether those clearly archetypal stories in Genesis are retellings or based in fact or myth? Why is that even an issue? Surely the real question is, what do these stories mean to us today? How do they speak to us? What can we learn from them? What is their theological relevance? What do they intend to tell us about God or faith or human beings? And how do we feel about all that? I mean, to worry about whether they are factually true is basically plain bloody daft, I think, because no one can prove anything about that anyway. It's a bit like Alice in the vestry. Remember Alice in the vestry at the end of the Vicar of Dibley? Completely missing Geraldine's wonderful punchlines to her jokes because she takes everything so literally. And I think that, that possibly, epitomizes what an awful lot of fundamentalism is about, that sort of straight-laced, earnest literalism that just doesn't get it, that doesn't get the punchline, whatever that is. But I'll tell you why it's important to some Christians, notably fundamentalists, that Genesis and the rest of the Bible is factually, historically, and scientifically correct. The reason is because they have bought into an ideology, and that's what it is, a belief system of biblical inerrancy or something quite like it. It's the idea that the Bible is factually correct in every way, or at least in everything that it affirms. And why is that important? Well, because it's integral to the ideological dogma that the Bible is literally the Word of God, and a lot of people's faith hinges on that belief. It's important to know, that fundamentalism is actually a relative newcomer to the scene. It's not part of long-term Christian tradition. It just dates back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And it developed actually as a result of, or as a reaction to, the whole emerging modern world and the scientific outlook, with the challenges which that presented to what were considered traditional Christian teachings. So, for example, geology began to reveal that the Earth is far older than the few thousand years suggested by, a crude reading of Genesis and the various biblical genealogies. We now know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not 5 or 10,000, as many creationists still maintain. And then there's the work of Charles Darwin and others, who established that humans emerged over millions of years through a process of biological evolution. I love the story of creation in Genesis, I do. But once you pit Genesis against science, instead of reading it for what it is, glorious, truthful myth, well, it's bound to lose the argument. As my Old Testament tutor used to tell his evangelical students who got uppity about this, he used to say, evolution is true, deal with it. And then there's the whole world of the social sciences, the emerging work of people like Freud and Jung and Karl Marx, which challenged biblical ideas about the origins of sin and the nature of humanity and society. And then finally there's, the world of critical and historical approaches to hermeneutics, which began to reveal the world behind the biblical texts, and in the process raised severe doubts about the authorship, the dates and the historical accuracy of many of the biblical texts. So liberalism, theological liberalism, is a response to such findings of the modern world. It's a way of reinterpreting and reconfiguring the Christian faith in the light of modern science and modern thought. It's a way of trying to be honest about faith in the face of new understandings. But here's the thing, fundamentalism is basically the flip side of liberalism, because both of them are as a result of, as a response to, the development of the modern outlook. The one, liberalism, receives the findings of modernity sympathetically. The other, fundamentalism, seeks to defend the faith against what is perceived as an attack of modernity on the fundamentals of the faith. The important point being that the way fundamentalism and all conservative approaches to faith defend Christianity against modernity is basically by accepting the basic assumption of modernity, which is that truth must always equate to fact, that in order for something to be true, it must be factually and literally and provably true. And that's why those Christians who defend their faith from within a fundamentalist paradigm need everything in the Bible to be literally and factually correct, because otherwise the fight against science and modernity is lost. And that's how they see it, even though actually that needn't be the case at all. In its formal sense, Christian fundamentalism was defined by the Northern Presbyterian Church in the United States in 1910, and it was formalized as a defense of 5 perceived fundamentals of Christian truth, namely biblical inerrancy, the divinity of Jesus Christ, his virgin birth, his bodily resurrection, and his return in glory, each of which it was believed were under threat from modernity and from its religious offspring, Christian liberalism. So liberalism became part of the enemy, maybe even more part of the enemy than modernity itself. So by trying to defend the Bible against a perceived attack from the modern outlook, by insisting on its scientific and historical accuracy, fundamentalism, I think, monumentally misunderstands the very nature of the Bible and the way that it can speak to us today. So look, progressive Christianity is liberal. It's liberal insofar as it embraces the acid bath of the modern critical outlook, the need to reflect intelligently and robustly on issues of faith, the need to draw on the fruits of science and history, as well as sociology and psychology in our interpretation of the Christian faith, and to not be threatened by that, but to see that it's all helpful. People sometimes ask me, what if, science could prove that there's no God, Dave? Would you accept that? To which I say, absolutely yes, of course I would. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a religious ostrich burying my head in the sand. But the question actually, you see, is actually a category mistake, because belief in God is not a question of science any more than love is a question of science, or whether I prefer the music of Bob Dylan to the Pussycat Dolls is a matter of science. Science can help me to refine questions like, what sort of God do I believe in? But it's not going to be able to tell me definitively if there is or isn't a God. That's not within its scope. But really, progressive faith, for me at least, is more deeply influenced by a postmodern or a post-critical outlook, which understands truth not just in terms of science and brute fact, but also truth expressed through symbols and metaphors, through poetry, storytelling, and playfulness. So truth isn't fixed to fact. Something doesn't have to be factual in order to be true, which is much more the modern outlook. But the postmodern plays around with the whole thing of, how we understand something to be true. The postmodern world also is inherently pluralistic. So there's not just one story, one interpretation of truth. There may be many, and indeed, exclusive claims to truth in the world we live in now are treated with suspicion as forms of power play or exercising control or imposing an agenda. The world has become inherently pluralistic, and I, for one, embrace that happily. For me, the Bible is the classic text of the Christian tradition. It's a central part of how Christians over the centuries have heard and understood God speaking to them, not because it was written or dictated by God, but because it reveals the imperfect struggles of people in both the Hebrew and the early Christian communities, their struggles to understand and interpret their faith in God. And I think that struggle remains pertinent and helpful, invaluable indeed to us today. But I certainly don't read the Bible for historical or scientific fact or for ethical quick fixes. I embrace and celebrate that the Bible is an historically and culturally conditioned text, that it reflects the life and attitudes and understandings of its time. It's a source of divine revelation mediated through ancient texts, which means that it's always going to have to be wrestled with and looked at critically. But it's mediated through texts and also through the communities that generated those texts. But Revelation certainly didn't end there with the Bible. Divine revelation is just everywhere in this wonderful world. I look for it in poetry, art and rock and roll, as my chapter in Black Sheep and Prodigals puts it. Let me just quote a little bit from that. I'll bring up a little piece from it, from my book, where I said this. I said, "Has God written any good tunes lately? Yes, of course. But you won't necessarily hear them in church, though you might. Wherever I look in the world, I discover divine revelation. At a music gig or on iTunes, in a poetry book or an art gallery, on TV, at the theatre, in the playfulness of a child or the liberated imagination of a grown-up. It enriches my life and sometimes calls me to a different life." See, for me, the Bible is a relentless source of wisdom and challenge. I love wrestling with its often peculiar, troubling stories, texts, and insights. I love wrestling with its symbols and its metaphors. I love to study it, to discuss it in sermons and talks and open forums. And sometimes when I look at the lectionary readings that my lovely rector, colleague and dear friend Anna gives me to preach on at St Leonard's in Streatham, I think when I look at the text that she's handed over to me, oh sugar, what the heck to do with these? Feels a little bit like, do you remember Ready Steady Cook? Well, I think it's on again, isn't it? Where a bunch of random ingredients are sort of poured out onto the surface, and the contestants have to come up with it, to do something with it. That's how it sometimes feels to me, but I love it. Sometimes the Bible puzzles me. Frequently it annoys me. Repeatedly it challenges me to look deeper into myself and into a tradition that endlessly fascinates me. So yeah, I'm certainly not giving up on the Bible, but I do think that the fundamentalist, and it's not just fundamentalists as such, but across much of the conservative sort of spread of Christianity, there is this monumental misunderstanding of the Bible, because the subtleties of its very nature are missed, because we feel that it has to stand up in the modern world by being completely credible and true, literally, historically, scientifically, and so on. I think that's a very big mistake. Okay, well, let's have a prayer. Spirit of the universe, who cannot be contained in words or books or buildings, whose presence we experience, often without realizing, in the song of birds and rushing wind, in mundane pleasures and passing daily wonders, help us learn to pause, stand still, look and listen, know you in the still small voice of life's humblest moments. And may we too become your open book, showing forth God's living word in laughter, tears and common courtesies. May we never lose sight of everyday mysteries, never miss divinity staring us full in the face. Amen. Well, I think that we should probably have a toast to that, don't you? So I do have a tiny little drop of whiskey with me, which I've mixed with some water. So if you've got something to toast with, join me now in a toast to God, to a God who hangs out in life's nooks and crannies, who is revealed, in a tiny field mouse in the bushes at the bottom of the garden, and the excited dog that, is barking away because he can't quite catch the mouse. I believe in God revealed in these things, a God who speaks through, croaking rooks flying overhead and long-tailed tits that are bustling around in the hedgerows. This is a toast to divine revelation everywhere in this amazing, awesome world which is our home. Dear friends, to life, l'chaim. And there it is. I'm going to shoot off home now. But if you like what I'm doing here and you want to support us, then you can buy us a coffee by going to the site, with the link of which is here on the screen. It's always at the top of the posts on the Holy Shed Facebook page, and we are hugely grateful to all of those of you who support us in this way and lots of other ways too.